Hello and welcome to the Inside Intelligence webinar series, brought to you by the Master of Science in Intelligence Analysis program and the Johns Hopkins University Office of Advanced Academic Programs. Today's event features a discussion on Africa at the center of global issues. My name is Natalie Cross and I'm the event producer. Please note today's event will be recorded and uploaded to the AAP YouTube channel under the Intelligence Analysis playlist. During the program, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function and we will answer as many questions as possible during the latter portion of the event. With that, I will turn over the presentation to our moderator, Dr. Michael Ard, Program Director for the Master of Science in Intelligence Analysis program.
Thank you very much, Natalie, and welcome everyone to Inside Intelligence. We're very pleased to have with us today my former colleague, Dr. Jerry Laurienti, who serves as an adjunct professor at Texas A&M's Bush School of Government and Public Policy in DC. He teaches African politics, regional affairs, demographics, development, and conflict. He also serves as the Bush School's DC Africa coordinator. Jerry spent 25 years as a national security professional, including in senior positions at CIA, U.S. State Department, and Department of Defense. In his last role, he served on CIA's leadership board, reserved for the senior team at the agency to make key decisions about the organization's future. He is the recipient of many awards, including the CIA Director's Award. And he served as senior leadership in charge of analysis on key issues and regions and topics in CIA, including Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, global energy, and climate. Jerry received his BA from the University of Southern California, where he earned a spot on the Trojan football team as a walk-on. He earned his MA and PhD from the University of Denver. He is the author of the U.S. Military and Human Rights Promotion Lessons from Latin America. We're very happy to have you with us here today, Jerry, to talk about Africa and its centrality in geopolitics. What do you have for us today?
Thanks, Michael. And also thanks to Johns Hopkins for hosting this. The Bush School has been really supportive of our Africa learning in the last several years, and we love when we can partner with people like you. So thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll say first that everything I say is my views, right, as standard, not my employer's views. So what I always like to start with when I have a Western audience is a couple of sort of baseline thoughts for anyone studying Africa, anyone jumping into Africa anew. And that is first and foremost is that Africa isn't a special case. It's a case. Just like any region of the world, Africa has things that are unique, but we should always guard against exoticizing Africa. I think that we have in the US a low literacy rate when it comes to all things Africa, and people tend to think of it as something different that stands out as quite unique. And the truth is that it's another region with its own unique aspects that I'll touch on. And the second piece is that you should always rely on a range of sources and voices. And so what I'm about to say today, I hope reflects accurately from a range of voices, including on the continent itself. So I want to focus on three key areas. First is I want to talk about some positive trends on the continent. I think the positive trends are easy to miss because the truth be told, there's a lot that's happening in Africa right now that's not positive. And indeed, it's spiking right now with conflict. So I'll touch on the positives. Then I'll talk about conflict and I'll touch on various conflicts across the region. And then finally, I'll end with a comment and a bit of a tour on foreign influence in Africa. So positive trends. So when you look at the global economy and you look at the fastest growing economies, inevitably every year, including last year, a good half of the top 20 fastest growing economies are in Africa. And I think that's surprising to a lot of people because they hear of the chaos in Africa. But the truth is that a lot of underdeveloped countries have what we call the catch-up effect, right? And so when you have an economy like Senegal or Ghana, where when you invest the new technology, there's a lot of upside growth. There's a lot of room for that economy to grow. And so we're seeing that growth across multiple economies in Africa. Now, the negative here, of course, is that most of these economies are definitely resource dependent. That the bulk of economic growth in Africa happens because of exports from natural resources. They're not very diversified, but where you see countries diversifying, you do see that economic bump. Directly related to that I think is a real positive for Africa, is that I think it's really the only region right now in the world that is doggedly focused on free trade. Africa adopted the continental free trade area about 4 years ago, and ever since has been really focused on free movement across borders, elimination of visas, and boosting inter-African trade. Trade outside of Africa is far greater than trade within the continent. And so this is really an attempt to realize the benefits within the continent. And in fact, even as we see how different regions and different countries react to US tariffs, the sound bites from the continent are, we've got to double down on African free trade. And so a pretty interesting and I think counter narrative coming out of Africa right now when it comes to trade that I think is productive for the continent. And then the last thing, and you'll hear Africa watchers say this time and again, because I think it maybe is the biggest positive, and that is Africa's demographics and youth. Often, I think in the West, and especially in Europe, where migration is a challenge with African migrants, the focus is on the negative. But the truth is that the employees of the future are going to be African. So right now, about 1 in every 5.5, 1 in every 6 people in the world is African. By 2050, it'll be 1 out of every 4. The median age is 19. And I'll make a bold prediction. While much of the political debate around the world right now is what do you do about migration, I will make that bold prediction that by 2050, that narrative will be instead competition for labor of all kinds and bidding on who can get the labor from Africa. And to just put some substantiation behind this, Kenya this year announced its plan to have 1 million legal migrants per year from the country to the Near East and Europe, 1 million, and they're quickly approaching that. Ethiopia last year alone had 700,000 individuals migrate to work, and this is it's return migration, so they return to the country. So just two countries in Africa, that's 1.7 million workers going to countries in the Near East and Europe that are shrinking every year and that can't sustain their economies without the labor and workforce that they see in Africa. The last thing I'll say about demographics is that demographics often can be destiny. And so when you look at countries like Nigeria, just over 200 million, by 2050, it'll be about double that. The numbers can get squishy, but most projections are 380 million to 440 million. But all demographers agree that by 2050, Brazil will leapfrog the United States as the 3rd largest country in the world, a position the US has held for quite some time. So again, quite a large labor force coming to the fore. So what I will say about the demographics is when you don't get it right, the demographics become one of the ingredients to conflict. And so I'll transition to conflict and talk a bit about I'm not going to talk about every conflict. There are many conflicts on the continent. And once again, I will just say, Africa is going through a particularly tough time right now with conflicts. So I'll go east to west. So Somalia, this is an intractable conflict. I think most Americans who hear Africa know it in part because of Somalia, because we've been involved all the way back to the early 90s. And of course, most Americans know Black Hawk Down, and which, by the way, I think that it goes on record as the first U.S. lives lost to extremists in battle. And so Africa never fails to put itself on the U.S. national security radar. But Somalia, even to this day, I think it's in better shape than it was 15 years ago. You can debate that, but it does have a government, but it is definitely steeped in conflict. And now it's not just an insurgency. 20, 30 years ago, it was an insurgency. But now, as most of you probably know, it is definitely an insurgency with terrorist organizations. So Al-Shabaab, that's Al-Qaeda aligned and has been for over 10 years, is really the powerhouse and, quite frankly, one of the stronger Al-Qaeda branches in the world. Probably just after AQAP, I think is a fair ranking. And then, of course, ISIS Somalia, which isn't ISIS's strongest branch, but it is a top earner. It taxes, it extorts, and so it's a big earner. And so the U.S., of course, is constantly involved there with Somalia, but it definitely is intractable, and it ebbs and flows. You see improvements, you see degradation, and I think right now we're sort of in a plateau of the government's efforts being able to chip away at Al-Shabaab and ISIS, and of course the U.S. has taken recent strikes there. Moving west, so Congo, also an intractable conflict. The Congolese conflict dates all the way back to the Rwandan genocide, when genocidaires and Hutu ethnic group individuals fled from Rwanda after the genocide against Tutsis, and ever since then there has been a conflict on and off again in Eastern Congo that, quite frankly, is far more than just ethnic. And in fact, I would say that the ethnic part of the conflict in Eastern Congo, you'll often hear Hutu and Tutsi. It's really about bad leadership and dysfunctional leaders pitting ethnic groups against each other. And so what we have going on there right now, and the big spike in conflict, is a group called the M23, a Rwandan-backed rebel group, has been on the offensive for a couple months and has seized key towns in Eastern Congo. And over the last couple months, pretty reputable reports of Rwandan forces on the ground with the M23. Now, Rwanda denies supporting the M23 publicly. I think even privately, they would probably kind of look the other way, but everyone knows it's Rwandan back. And they deny that they have Rwandan troops on the ground, but there are multiple sources that suggest they do. Why are they there? They claim that there are forces within Congo that are anti-Tutsi and anti-Rwanda. That's true to an extent, but it's also rooted in critical minerals. Rwanda is a big mineral exporter, and by the way, most of those minerals come from Congo, not from Rwanda. So it definitely is a control of territory issue. It's definitely linked to the minerals, and there's multiple complexities there with dozens of armed groups. And of late, Congo offered to the United States an exchange of critical mineral access for guarantees of security. We'll see where that goes. I don't know how well Congo could ever guarantee access to its minerals without actual security forces on the ground from the country they're guaranteeing them from, but it's an interesting offer nonetheless. Also, peace or ceasefire talks are ongoing there. Qatar hosted some a couple of weeks ago. Not real sure how real it is, but it is ongoing. So we'll see where that goes. Sudan. So Sudan, on and off again, has been unstable since independence, 1956, and it is steeped in what is really, I would say, right now, the world's largest humanitarian disaster. It's a 2-year-old civil war. We're at the 2-year anniversary. It's going into its 3rd year. And for the first time ever, this is the 3rd Sudanese civil war. For the first time ever, though, the war is focused on the capital, and it's in Khartoum. And in fact, just a couple of weeks ago, the Sudanese armed, so the groups are the Sudanese armed forces on one side, which a lot of international observers recognize as sort of the official government, to the extent that there is one. And they're pitted against the rapid support forces, so the special forces. So two military groups vying for control, some 150,000, most likely that's a close number of how many have died. But the even grander disaster that is quoted regularly is nearing 14 million displaced, or 13 million displaced, excuse me. About 4 million of those displaced are refugees in neighboring countries. So, for example, South Sudan, one of the most unstable countries in the world, is host to 1 million refugees from Sudan. And now South Sudan, with its own insecurity and instability, and possibly on the brink of a renewed civil war there, is host to some million refugees. And those refugees, some of them are South Sudanese who are returning from Sudan. And now going back to Sudan again. So you have this back and forth instability. You also have famine. There's famine across multiple sectors of Sudan. And then finally, you have ethnic cleansing. The rapid support forces really have engaged in what we saw their predecessor, the Janjaweed forces, commit in Darfur. So once again, really just a humanitarian disaster in Sudan. I'll touch on Sudan again in a minute when we talk about foreign influence, because there's a lot of it happening there. And then finally, the Sahel. So the Sahel, greatly unstable, depending on how you count, anywhere from 6 to 9 coups and coup attempts over the last 4 years. The Sahel technically actually runs all the way from Senegal in the west to Sudan in the east, but where most of the focus is right now on the conflict zone is Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. And when I'm talking about conflict here, I'm talking about with extremists. So multiple Al-Qaeda and ISIS affiliated groups, they're seizing territory, recruiting young fighters in the thousands. And all told, Africa in the last several years has had some 20,000, depending on how you count, 20,000 fatalities due to extremist and extremist-related conflict. Most of those coming out of the Sahel, also some in Somalia, but Sahel is definitely the most violent. You could argue, it's arguable that the Sahel is the most violent terrorist active region in the world. It definitely has the highest numbers of fatalities and terrorist members that are active. And so the coups, definitely one ingredient in those coups was because of the insecurity and because of the terrorism, and the juntas essentially used insecurity as one reason for coming to power. So steeped in the insecurity there for sure. Now I'll transition last thing and then to push it back to you for Q&A, and that is foreign influence. So foreign influence isn't new in Africa, and in fact, foreign influence goes back hundreds of years, well before the United States was a country. But it definitely is spiking. It's definitely Africa is experiencing a surge in foreign influence right now. So I'll talk about a few of the players. China is the big one that most people talk about. China definitely has moved from being a regular player in Africa to, I would argue, probably the top player, especially as it pertains to trade. That by far and away the largest trader with African countries. It's not even close. It's nearing 300 billion a year. It's 4 times what the United States trades with the African continent. And this trade is for economic gain, but it is also definitely for influence. I think a lot of Africa watchers, a lot of China watchers, a couple decades ago, argued that it was just for economics, but we know now that it absolutely is to promote the Chinese model of governance and the Chinese model of economic growth with that autocratic governance. So China is the big player there. China is also popular. China and the US are about even, and they've been this way for the last several years. When you look at Afrobarometer, the US is popular too. right? Neither of them are tanking. And it's about even. But I will say both of them, we've seen a decrease in the last couple of years of both the US and Chinese approval ratings, if you will, across the continent. But it's definitely popular to do business with China because they don't have a lot of rules, they don't have a lot of conditions, and they're willing to trade without very many bureaucratic hurdles. So a big player on the continent. Russia. Russia has been a big player for decades. It has been and still is the top provider of military arms and equipment. But of late, the big story for Russian influence is Africa Corps and misinformation or disinformation. So Africa Corps, it started as a private military company. It was once called Wagner Group. It was run by Prigozhin. And after Prigozhin's death, Russia stopped denying that it was aligned with Wagner and has now started to sort of fold it under the military. It's branded it as Africa Corps, and I would say it operates as a sort of mercenary paramilitary group. And what does it do? It essentially exchanges security for resources. And so it's in multiple countries across the region and with some mixed results. I would say a primary country that often doesn't get mentioned, but is super important here is Central African Republic. And it's important because it's been Wagner or Africa Corps has been in Central African Republic longer than any other African country. And it essentially provides security and in fact is embedded within the government of Teodoro, the president. This is an area where, quite frankly, Africa Corps has been successful. Without Africa Corps, I don't know that the president would still be there. So they've provided the security for his regime. And that's how they've promised that same security to autocratic regimes. So now Russia is embedded in Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, offering advice. And in fact, the foreign ministers of the three countries just returned from Russia with a big deal for arms and training of some 5,000 troops in the Sahel region. And what does Russia get in exchange? Access to timber, access to minerals, big extraction of resources that Russia needs. I would go out on a limb and I would also say that the longer game here also includes, and you can see it with how Wagner or Africa Corps is fighting in Ukraine, access to people. Russia is shrinking, and these African countries, Niger has the highest fertility rate in the world, right? And so you can get fighters from these countries, and we've already seen the early signs of that. Just a couple more comments on foreign influence, and then I'll wrap up. France has been a traditional power in Africa for a very long time, for a couple hundred years, and we see probably the biggest retreat of African influence that we've seen definitely in our lifetimes. All the countries I mentioned, the African countries have kicked the French out. And we have multiple other countries where the relationship was fine and there isn't economic instability or political instability, and they're also kicking France out. So Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, Chad fits in the unstable bin, but not the same as the other Sahel countries. So definitely on decline. I think that's important because it's obviously a close NATO ally, a close US partner, and the US usually has followed France's lead when it comes to security operations and policies in West Africa, or at least Francophone West Africa. And I think that transition is putting that approach into question. Finally, just a minute on other powers, right? Like what I just mentioned is sort of the great power competition, but there are a lot of middle powers, Gulf countries in particular. The UAE is a huge provider of weapons, resources, foreign direct investment. It's the biggest player in the Sudan war, supporting the rapid support forces. Turkey is a huge player across the continent, also a provider of weapons. In fact, I would argue that the UAE and Turkey were the definitive difference in the recent civil war in Ethiopia that went from 2020 to 2022, with provision and training for the use of drones that turned the tide of the fight and kept the government in power. And finally, I'll mention India. India is understudied and understood on Africa, but India, for example, is the #2 trading partner for the entire continent. It outstrips the United States by tens of billions of dollars. And I think influence there is likely to grow. So, Michael, that's a lot. That's a big tour. I'll leave it there and happy to take any questions, comments that you've got. I think you're muted.
Yeah, I am muted. Thanks for that. That's a great overview. Let's talk a little bit about right now the U.S. influence, and our focus has been, I think, largely military. Obviously, we've had diplomatic relations, we've had aid programs for many years, big aid programs. But let's talk a little bit about the military presence, because that's been, I think, on the front burner lately.
Yeah. So the military presence in the U.S. is definitely, I would say, in most cases, quite welcome. It is arguably the biggest source of influence that the United States has on the continent. Usually, I would say we're looking at about 6,000 boots on the ground when you count Camp Lemonnier and Djibouti, and then the different deployments across the entire continent. And so those contingents and those defense attaché offices really often operate in a sort of military diplomatic way, where the partner countries, and even those countries where we tend to have kind of back and forth frenemy like relationships, that mill-to-mill relationship is really valued. And I would say even more, just as much on the civ mill side as it would be in the hard military sort of battle preparedness and training. So things like med-readies, civic action deployments, helping construct, helping vaccinate cattle. Time and again, if you're traveling on the continent and you talk to the military, they'll say these types of engagements are the most positive engagements. And I would also say that, especially now, you can have a debate. I've had a lot of debates with Africa watchers over what is the U.S. top influence. And I think usually Africa watchers would say PEPFAR, which was the president's plan to combat AIDS. Mm-hmm. That's now shut down. And so I would say definitively now, without it, that it would have to be military partnership. And so, again, I don't mean war fighting here. I mean mill-to-mill relations, and just the standard day-to-day exchanges, the interactions with military counterparts on the continent, managed through AFRICOM.
One of the things that you mentioned early on, as a big focus of global terrorism right now is occurring in the Sahel. Mm-hmm. 3 countries in particular are kind of the stand out. All 3 have had coups. All 3, we've had a certain amount of counterterrorism operations going on. I think that's fair to say. What went wrong here? I mean, we started out where it was pretty low, an area of involvement. It has exploded in the last several years now. I guess last 4 or 5, I suppose. What went wrong for us on the counterterrorism side in this part of Africa? Yeah,
I think first and foremost, what the people in those 3 countries would say, and that I think I would mostly agree with them, is that what went wrong is there was a French lead on the ground that took the approach of, we'll go alone, you follow us, with local troops and local forces. And the local forces came to resent that. When it did work, it was to France's credit. When it didn't work, it was because things weren't working in the country, and it grew animosity. And as the security situation did not improve tremendously, especially in Mali and Burkina Faso. Niger, different case. I will say that terrorism was slightly declining during the coup, and I think that was used as an excuse. But Mali and Burkina Faso, the terrorists and the terrorism only increased over the 10 years or so that the French were leading the fight in those countries. And I don't think that there was a lot of dialogue that led to productive partnership on the ground there. And so it really empowered the junta leaders to take control and to jump in and take over. But I would go a level deeper than that, Michael. And I would say, and quite frankly, every military fighter, whether it's SOCAF or AFRICOM or the National Guard units that had served in Mali or Niger, to a person, they would argue, and academics would argue, a broad agreement at this point, that the fight on terrorism needs to be focused on the cause, not on the terrorism itself. And so when we look at Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali, the draw here for all these fighters, by and large, is not them feeling a call to be Islamic extremists. It is a large young population that is unemployed and doesn't see avenues for them to have a productive life. And when terrorists are willing to give them a gun and a truck and something to do, they take it up. And so we're seeing the results of impoverished Africa. And I would say we don't have the answer to that. I'm not going to sit here and claim that if we had invested and put aid in, that would have been the answer, because the truth is we have invested a lot of aid in Africa. And I think there are different places where it's had an effect positively, like PEPFAR. There are other places where we really haven't seen the positive effect. And I think the Sahel is one of them. I think local ownership, just a last comment on this, these countries that we're talking about, the 3 countries we're talking about, they want agency. And I agree with that. And they deserve some of the blame here, right? That part of what went wrong is corruption, a lack of local investment in education, healthcare, and economic planning. And while there are rooted pieces of that go back to colonialism, most Africanists from the continent will say, understood, but local leaders have to take ownership. And there's a piece there as well.
Let's talk about coups, and then I'm going to turn it over to the rest of the audience for their questions. And thanks for these great questions, everybody. But I just want to ask this one. So globally, for a long time, we had seen a decline in coup attempts.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, we had this eruption of coups in the area we're talking about. Some of them, Mali's had a few.
Yeah.
And recently, of course, Niger, and which led to us being evicted. But some have been to impose military government. Some have been to oppose democratic developments. What do you make of this this coup wave? And is this something that we are going to see more of in Africa?
Yeah, I'd say there are multiple ingredients here. This is a complex mix coup wave. There's a tendency to just see it as a bit of a domino effect. I do think that there is. I've had many debates with my fellow Africa watchers of whether there was contagion. I think that there was an ounce of it, but I think that it is definitely deeper than just a couple ingredients. So I'll name a few things that get to the complexity. So first, on the opposition to democracy, I would say that it's opposition to how democracy was working, not opposition to democracy as a preferred form of governance. And in fact, if you look across Africa today, still polling shows that democracy is the preferred form of government. It's declining, but what is increasing is dissatisfaction with how democracy is working. And so we look at these countries, and while they have democracies, they were deeply corrupt and deeply ineffective at providing security and economic opportunity. And so what I tell my students, quite frankly, is in the US, when we don't like who's in office, we vote to change whoever's in office. And when you're in the Sahel and the elections are shoddy and the government is illegitimate in how they do their work, quite frankly, a lot of the people on the ground see their efforts to overthrow them in an unconstitutional way as their version of civic action. That's weird to the Western mind. I understand, but the truth is that they see it. They're celebrating on the ground, and when Westerners say, "How could you celebrate the overthrow of a democratic government?" and they look back and say, "Well, what do you mean? They weren't democratic. We want them to be democratic." Now, the flaw in their argument: they're propping up autocratic regimes that are even less democratic, even less effective at security, and even less effective in some cases at the economic opportunity, right? And so it's very short-sighted, the support, I think, for coups. Coups almost rarely make things better. There are cases of military leaders transitioning to more democratic government. I think Ghana is a case going back a couple of decades, but it's pretty rare. And so I think it is a very young population that's fed up and doesn't see a path of success. Another key ingredient here, quite frankly, is the anti-French sentiment that I named. I won't put this all on the French because there's another element here that absolutely played a role, and that is the disinformation campaign by the Russians. Before these coups, there was pretty widespread belief in Mali, for example, that the French were assisting the terrorists to an unbelievable extent, right? Locals on the ground thinking that the French were there actually helping Al-Qaeda, actually helping ISIS. And it for sure is not true, but that was the narrative. And when that narrative takes hold and you already have resentment against your former colonial master, it leads to instability and a coup. So those are three ingredients. There are more, but I think there's multiple facets.
Okay, let's go to some more questions. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
And let's talk about the Democratic Republic of the Congo and how there's local interventions, and Eba was asking about the leadership there and why. Essentially, the question is, why are there proxy wars going on in the Congo, and why isn't there a central government really effective enough to do something about this?
Yeah. So first of all, the central government in Congo is quite illegitimate. It came to power with a flawed election that was backed by a former president. It was sort of a behind-the-scenes deal. No one really thought that Felix Tshisekedi won the election. And then he ran again and won. And once again, the election was quite flawed. But I will say that it's never really been the case over the last many decades that any leader in Congo has had full control of the eastern portion of the country. So think of, first of all, this country is massive. It's not an excuse, but just as perspective, this is like the United States east of the Mississippi, right? You look at it on a map and you think, oh, maybe Texas. No. This is the eastern United States. It's gigantic. And in the middle of it is the world's second largest jungle area and tropical forest. And so the eastern part is almost like a completely separate country, far more accessible by Rwanda and Uganda. And so Rwanda and Uganda have had far more professional, effective military forces for decades. And once they invaded Rwanda to dispense with the Hutu genocidaires in 1994 or 1995 after the genocide, they never really left. And so remnants of those forces stayed back, influencers from those forces stayed back, and Rwanda and Uganda stayed involved in Eastern Congo in a way that allowed them access to the natural resources. For example, Uganda is a net exporter of gold, and the gold doesn't come from Uganda. It comes from Congo. And so the eastern part that is really influenced and dominated by external actors and dozens of armed factions keeps it unstable. And the central government, which is weak, definitely one of the most corrupt governments in all of Africa, which, by the way, is rooted all the way back into the Mobutu era of the 1960s, who the United States supported quite closely, that it keeps it from being functional. It just does not have the institutions or the culture or the know-how to effectively manage the eastern part of its country.
So meanwhile, we're going to be apparently discussing a Ukraine-like deal with Congo on resources for security.
Yeah.
And I think based on that overview, I'd be pessimistic about whether we could actually pull off much on the security side.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if it would. I don't know what the deal would look like, but I think Congo would want more than just the threat against Rwanda. That's what held the M23 at bay for 10 years, but they came back, and I don't know that would be enough. And if Congo asks the United States to put boots on the ground, I don't know what the response would be, but I think that might be a bit far-fetched. I will say, though, just because so few people know this, and the Western mind of the importance of Congo and Africa isn't, again, our literacy rate isn't very high. Just a fun fact that I think is important. Eastern Congo was the source of more than 75%, probably higher than 85% of the enriched uranium that was what built the 2 atomic bombs that were dropped on Japan. And at the time, we absolutely had troops on the ground in Eastern Congo guarding the uranium mines where those minerals were extracted. And so this relationship and the importance of the critical minerals goes back decades.
Yeah. Well, that was under during the colonial period, right?
Correct.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go. A couple of questions on great power competition. Walker, Bill ask about, okay, so what, in other words, what's our approach here? You have, with respect to getting involved in great power competition with China and Russia in the region. They look like they're pursuing different paths themselves in the region, although there's certain convergence. What does our getting engaged in this competition look like?
Yeah, I think that, so first, Russia and China definitely have different approaches, right? Russia is almost fully in the security for resources, and China is in economic transactions and influence with those transactions. I would answer it by saying what is in the U.S. interest, and what does the U.S. have? What does the United States have at stake in Africa? And I would say it's multifold. So first and foremost, I would say that the United States only suffers when it decides that Africa is not high enough to pay attention to, because the truth is that Africa comes back to bite the U.S. on the national security front time and again. So I mentioned Black Hawk Down. A year after Black Hawk Down was the Rwandan genocide. Fast forward another 4 years, 1998 was the bombings of the embassy in Kenya and Tanzania. Then fast forward to the early 2000s before 9/11, and Osama bin Laden is hiding out in Sudan. Fast forward another 10 years, and you have the Arab Spring, which was started in Tunisia, and we're still seeing the fruits of the Arab Spring in Sudan. It definitely is a remnant of the Arab Spring. And so I would say one factor for the U.S. to consider is whether you want to be engaged or not, you should definitely keep your eye on the security implications. The second piece definitely is economic. Africa is small potatoes in the trade realm for the United States. We're looking at $75 billion in trade right now. I would say it shouldn't be looked at right now for the current status. I think that it should be looked at as the potential. I mentioned earlier the catch-up effect. Africa arguably is the largest growing market by demographics in the world, the highest upside in the world. And so when you have multiple small economies that aren't developed yet, the upside of not having a saturated market is quite large. And so the economic opportunities, I would say, in Africa are sky high. One thing I didn't mention is the innovation and entrepreneurship in Africa that a lot of Americans don't focus on. But for example, the first successful large-scale mobile banking effort was M-Pesa, which is Kenyan mobile banking. Before any Americans were doing mobile banking, the Kenyans had it wired. And so with this low-level development comes innovation. And so there's great innovation on the continent that I would say should be a second key factor for Americans to look at when considering competition there. And then third, I would say the diplomatic heft. I didn't talk about this. A lot of people don't think about this because I think that they missed the scorecard, but Africa is 54 countries. That makes up more than a quarter of the UN. And it's rarely monolithic, but when they vote in large blocks, it absolutely has an impact. It absolutely makes a swing. And even if it's annoying, I'm not saying you have to support this or not, but even when it's annoying, if an influential African country decides to wield influence in the global South, it can have implications for the United States. So, for example, look at South Africa leading the charge in the ICJ case against Israel in Gaza. Absolutely has led the front there and is leading the global South in the anti-Israeli effort over the last year and a half. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Let's talk about AFRICOM. And Sarah asked about the idea being floated, which may actually happen, about AFRICOM being folded back into EUROCOM. Implications for that. This isn't the first time that's been brooded about.
No, yeah, and I think in fact Michael and I were talking about the recent testimonies by the combined testimony by the two commanders before Congress. I actually think a couple of good points were made there. One is the growth of terrorism on the continent and the need to deal with that. I would get broader than that. I would say my previous response about the ability for African insecurity to have big ramifications for the United States is something to consider. If the United States is considering putting AFRICOM back in EUCOM, a question is, can EUCOM handle it if there's a major crisis? And it's absolutely, I just walked through 4 decades, it's absolutely not off the table that there's a major crisis that absorbs resources. Another key issue to ask is, if it's small enough to handle right now, is that something that you want to have EUCOM handle to add on to what it's doing, or is it a matter of simply downsizing? Are there opportunities for AFRICOM to do what it's doing in a smaller way? And then the last piece that I would say there is that, and again, is mirroring my earlier comments about how to factor when you're looking at Africa and great power competition, and that is the military access is, I see it as a diplomatic access. And I think that diplomatic access leads to things like public-private partnerships and leads to access to economic opportunities on the continent and in countries across Africa where the US probably would benefit from partnership.
Great. Let's talk about the few other issues that come up. We've got about 10 minutes left. I'll try to get as many questions in as possible. Thanks for the good ones. We mentioned early on, or you did it toward the end, about other powers involved in the continent. Let's talk about the Middle Eastern countries, Turkey, UAE, Qatar too.
Yeah.
What do they see as their involvement? What do they see to gain here? And are they working at cross purposes with each other?
Yes, they're working at cross purposes. It's almost like cooperative conflict, and it's very predictable in many ways. that where you see a conflict, you can bet that 2, 3, 4 of them will be involved, Saudi Arabia being another one. What are they looking for? Resources and influence. And unfortunately, let's start with the second one, the influence. Unfortunately, even though Africa has been bandied about as a place where countries vie for influence for hundreds of years, I think much of the world sees Africa as still a free agent. And to an extent, it's true, right? You go to Africa and it isn't like, oh, this is America's sphere. And decreasingly, not Europe's sphere. And so there is some free agency there. And Africa also says, hey, we're not in anyone's sphere. And so it leads to up and coming powers like the UAE, Turkey reemerging and wanting to rebuild its Ottoman stretch. It leads to involvement in Africa where you can get influence, where you couldn't otherwise get it or earn it. Definitely, you're not going to get it in Western Europe, right? It's very hard to do the same thing in Latin America, in the Western Hemisphere. And so you can compete in these countries. And while you're competing, at least you can get some of the return in resources, access to gold, access to oil, access to timber, and a market for your weapons. So there's a lot to be had there for you to sell, for you to take out and re-export. And then if you are on the winning side, now you are friends with a country that is going to do well and favor you. Look at Ethiopia again. Definitely very close now with Turkey and UAE, and Turkey and UAE took the government's side, and really that has propped up relations between those three countries.
Let's talk about partnerships with the U.S. One, I mean, we mentioned about we've lost a couple, but we also have some very significant ones in the region. Before we got on the air here, we were talking about Kenya. Could you expand on this a little bit on our partnerships? I'm gleaning this from a few of the questions in the chat.
Yeah, sure. So there are a lot of countries. So first of all, going back to that, right? I like the American attitude of not being lackadaisical and saying, hey, China's kicking our butt. We got to do better. Russia's kicking our butt. We got to do better. The truth is it's mixed. And the US is a well-appreciated country in many respects. There are places where it's less welcome. But again, it is a pretty popular partner. And I would say that most of Africa actually wants America to be a stronger partner. And quite frankly, African leaders and African business people often like the transactional approach. They don't want the political approach. So there may be some openings here. So we talk about countries that are friendly and longstanding allies. You look at a Kenya where we have a longstanding positive relationship, and there's even give back, right? So whether it's successful or not is another story, but you see a country like Kenya putting security forces in Haiti. So actually investing in the Western Hemisphere and putting skin in the game in our hemisphere. Countries like Ghana who are willing to make sure that they're voting with the United States on many UN efforts when we need them, and really partnering economically with the United States. And then you look at partners where I think that there's some controversy, but so it's worth talking about. Partners like Rwanda. Rwanda has been one of the stronger U.S. partners since the early 1990s. Is very well organized, lacks corruption, and really economically growing and stable. And it's one of the top peacekeeping contributors. It's Africa's top peacekeeping contributor. So we can count on Rwanda. Downside, Kagame absolutely has rules with an autocratic approach. And so when we see him getting involved in places like Congo, it only causes headaches for us. But definitely has been a partner in the region and outside the region as well.
I want to get back to a question Barbara asked, bringing us back to the theme of our series, intelligence, is what's the best role for U.S. intelligence when policymakers traditionally have not focused on Africa except during periods of high counterterrorism involvement?
Yeah, what I would say is, again, I'm going to look at it from the Africa perspective here that I would agree with. And this is almost a broad, I love the question because I would apply it to economics, I would apply it to trade, I would apply it to security, and that is the desire for a strong partnership. They don't want aid as much as they would like partnership. We just lifted all the aid, and the narrative from most of the continent is, yeah, actually, the continent needs to do better. And what we would like, America, is partnership. And so when you look at a sector like intelligence, to a person, you could go to Ghana today, you could go to Kenya, you could go to a country like Angola where the relationship is warming. And if you ask them beyond specifics, right, of course there may be specifics, but if you ask what's your big sort of macro ask on intelligence, they're going to say, we want a real partnership. We want to learn from you, and we want to contribute to you. We know how a lot of the things work here on the continent. We can provide some insights as well. And so they don't want a one-way street. They want a partnership, and that doesn't mean they have as much to offer as us. They wouldn't pretend that they do, but they absolutely would say, hey, we want to give and take here, and we want you to be strong in that partnership. We don't want you to tiptoe around us and think of us as, oh, poor Africa, right? Like back to where I started. It's not a special case. It's just another case. And that's how leaders and individuals on the continent, I think, would approach the US if we were asking the question on the continent.
I'm going to end with a question of my own, and then thanks everybody for your patience and your great questions, and thanks for this great presentation on Africa, Jerry. You started out talking about Africa and development. One of the things that struck me in reading the UN's Human Development Index over the years is how well actually Africa has done over the years on the human development side, which is directly impactful to a lot of the things you're talking about.
Yeah.
Can you speak to that for a few minutes?
Yeah. So what I tell my students is a good way to see the Human Development Index is healthy, wealthy, and smart. Right. That's what it's measuring. Is there investment in healthcare? Is there investment in education? Is there investment in economic growth and opportunity? And I would say that it's interesting. I'm glad that you said that, because you look across the board, education, healthcare, economic growth, economic development, and infrastructure. Across the board, Africa has improved leaps and bounds, but all things are relative, right? The continent definitely is far, far away from the developed world. And so it's still often looked at from the Western world as a huge deficit. What I would say is that there has been growth, and it's been growth because of, in the countries where it's most profound, because of committed investment and a plan that they stick to that's intentional. These plans are intentional, right? You go to a Rwanda or an Ethiopia or a Kenya, and they have plans on, here's the healthcare plan, here is the education plan, here is the economic infrastructure plan, often which, by the way, involves Chinese investment because they need it, just like the US needs China to buy our debt, right? So they have plans, and where you see those plans, you see those countries growing well. However, here's the however, it's not enough. There are obstacles, and I would name the two biggest obstacles that I think are corruption. It's endemic in some countries like Congo, where you don't see very good growth on the HDI index. Corruption is more institutionalized than healthcare, education, or economic planning. So corruption is one, and then the other big one, which we've talked about, conflict. You see countries like Ethiopia. Ethiopia has what it takes to be to realize a demographic dividend like the Asian tigers. If it could stop fighting with itself and its neighbors and have stability for a generation, you could see an economic boom taking advantage of that growing human development index.
Thanks very much. I think that's a very good way to end it today. Thank you, Jerry Laurienti, for this great presentation on Africa. Hope to have you back to talk about it again.
Great.
And I'd like to flag for everybody that we will have a recording of this available in a couple of days on our Johns Hopkins AAP YouTube web channel. So please check that out. I think you'll also probably get a recording in your inbox too if you were on today. And I'd like to also highlight for you that on April 30th, we'll have another Inside Intelligence program. Our guest will be Dr. Janelle Harvin, and he will talk about, is domestic intelligence broken? So that's on April 30th, same time. Jerry, thank you very much for being with us today. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks, Michael. Thank you, everybody. Glad to be here.